are going to have a lecture today from my friend Christoffer Bovbjerg, and his lecture is Japanese history, the standard narrative. The PowerPoint has disappeared off the
Yeah, he likes to go to sleep.
So Chris is a doctoral candidate at UC Berkeley across the bay. He passed his exams, yay! So he's starting his 5th year in the department this fall, and his focus is on pre-modern Japan, specifically the medieval period, and more specifically law and governance in the Kamakura period, which is from 1185 to 1333, and about which you'll hear more shortly. Last year, Chris talked specifically about law and government in the Kamakura era, but this year we've brought him back to give you the whole shebang. So without further ado.
Thanks. Hi, good to be here. Good to be back. So it sounds like you guys have gotten a pretty good introduction from Andrea, so I apologize. We're going to probably go over a lot of the things she said already, and if there's any point where you'd like me to go into more detail, I'd be happy to do so. It's really hard to go through and just touch on the... Writing this outline was impossible because I wanted to make it like 30 pages long. Yeah. And then, this is an outline. So forgive me if I do delve into detail. I'd really like talking about Japanese history. So if you have questions, I would love to talk about it. If you have anything pressing or relevant to what we're going over, if you'd like more detail, please speak up. Otherwise, I think we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So today, I'd like to talk about the standard narrative of Japanese history. And as I see it, the historian's job can be defined somewhat simply if it, as Andrea pointed out, very complicated to do. So in essence, we like to ask questions, gather evidence, and then make an argument. And so today, I'd like to present an argument. So this is what I will argue is the standard periodization of Japanese history. And that in of itself is an argument. So periodization is a tricky thing. There are a million ways you could do it. So this is the standard political narrative on the left, drawn up, and it goes down. So I couldn't figure out how to do this very well in a PowerPoint, so I just have it in Word because it's long. So you can see I broke it up along the lines on the handout. So this is generally political history. It's organized by who holds power and often where they hold power. But there are many other ways to periodize Japanese or any history. It's essentially just a technique to establish patterns, a better way to understand a really complex hunk of time. 12,000 years, not so easy to take on just all at once. So political history has become the standard. And this periodization in particular is a little over 100 years old. It's been the standard since the first Western historians began writing about Japan. And it's been tinkered with a bit over time. But it does build on a native Japanese tradition which goes back to the 8th century of doing a focus on political, where at first they focused on imperial reigns. And if you ever look up a Japanese history book in Japanese, which obviously very useful to English speakers, you'll find they still organize it by reign name, and sometimes they change the era names. It's a mess. So it's really not any fun. But here are some other ways you could look at periodization just to give you a sense of the sort of artificiality of this, so that you could arrange it in any number of ways. But don't take this too seriously. Political narrative, you can take that very seriously. Go politics. The rest of it, take it or leave it. There's a lot of stuff out there. So in addition to being the standard narrative, which is what you'll get in most textbooks and academic work, and it's very useful to have that because it's sort of a key to understanding how other people are organizing their work. A political narrative will give you sort of an understanding of a lot of big picture changes happening in Japanese history. So these are often tied to the power holders and these political changes. And these affect, of course, everyone. When you have a regime change where, for instance, they institute a new tax regime, most people are going to be affected by that. However, this is a very narrow focus. At times, the political power holders are 1/10 of 1% of the population. It's a very small group. At other times, for instance, during the early modern era, you have samurai in charge. It's maybe up to 6 to 8% of the population are samurai, but only a fraction within that actually hold any real political power. So this is a narrow focus, and it doesn't give you as much of a sense of what life was like for most people, or a lot of things that are going on outside of the halls of power. So there are significant limitations to this periodization. That said, let's get started. Oh, another preliminary thing. So pronunciation, I don't know if you guys have gone over it. This is a mnemonic that my advisor, as far as I'm aware, made up that I find very helpful. So there are 5 vowel sounds in Japanese, a, I, u, e, o, and you can remember them from the park bistro has a super red glow. And so these sounds are always pronounced the same way no matter how they're put together. So for instance, the Japanese word for delicious is oishi. So it's oi and it's oishi, always. And there are a bunch of consonant sounds which you needn't worry about too much. They're mostly very similar to English. The other thing is, if you have a macron, a line over a vowel, it gets 2 beats. So instead of being Tokyo, it's Tokyo, ideally, but it gets anglicized a lot. Or Osaka, and Shoen is something we'll look at today, which I really like. It's a medieval estate. And geography. I'd imagine you're all familiar with Japan, but obviously that it's an island nation, that it has very favorable natural conditions, and that it is close but not connected to the continent, very significant. All right, so the first period, Jomon. I get the sense you guys have looked at pottery already, so this should be familiar. Jomon is obviously, it's called Jomon for its pottery, which means a rope cord pattern, which you can see on the right side. So they pressed rope against the jars, against the clay to make this pattern. And it's significant. Like Andrea, I'm more interested in pottery for its social and political aspects rather than for art. But in addition to looking really cool, I think, it's quite significant because pottery in Japan, or extant pottery shards that have been found in Japan, have been dated to be the oldest in the world, or at least the oldest found so far. So it's significant that the Japanese may have invented pottery, but that they had it at such an early date is indicative of a surplus. When you have pottery, you can keep extra things you find. This is largely a hunter-gatherer society. They're small, mostly egalitarian bands, so people are mostly on an equal basis with whoever is in charge. But with a surplus that you're able to store in these, you're allowed to have some amount of specialization. So you could have a ritual specialist. You could have a chieftain who doesn't necessarily have to provide for himself. But this is the bulk of Japanese history, is Jomon and earlier, of course. But there's very little we can say about it. So these guys lived in pit dwellings, in settlements from which they'd migrate seasonally. Did you have a question?
Do we know they're egalitarian?
We can guess they're egalitarian from what we find or don't find. So the house size seems to be very similar. You don't see any elaborate jewelry or other trappings buried with anyone. The burials seem to be mostly similar as well. But it's hard to say because there's only so much evidence. Actually, Japan is incredibly rich in archaeological evidence compared to many other places. But even so, you have pottery, you can find post holes and the occasional skeleton or tools, but there's not a whole lot. So we can guess that they're egalitarian, I should say. And so yeah, please absolutely critically question everything I say, because that's the whole point of making this argument, is you need to have it backed up with evidence and a conclusive, or at least tentative argument threading it together. So the next period is the Yayoi. So Yayoi is named for a district in Tokyo where they found this different type of pottery. Well, it's less ornate, certainly, than the Jomon. It served different purposes, not surprisingly. So the one on the left, you can see a char mark. So this was used for cooking, and it's a different kind of pottery technique. I don't know enough to tell you how different it is, but
It was pit-fired.
Pit-fired, all right.
Because anytime you have the black on it, it means that it was in another land.
Yeah. And these are all from the collection here. All these pictures in this style, at least. And you can see, so I'm also banking on the description on the museum's website, telling us that this is probably a cooking pot on the left. And on the right, given its narrow base, it seems unlikely that it had a utilitarian purpose. It's more likely a ritual piece of pottery, although I think it's good to be skeptical about anything to do with religion. Mostly historians, and I think archaeologists as well, if they don't know what something is, they'll say it's probably religious. So it's something of a catch-all. So in Yayoi, you also have an influx of migration from the continent. You have a wave of new immigrants, and with them, they bring rice agriculture, which is a pretty significant change. So I'd imagine many of you associate white rice quite strongly with Japan. And it's a big deal. The switch to agriculture, which does not happen overnight but takes hundreds of years, is a significant one in that it allows for a greater surplus and leads to a more sedentary lifestyle. So people are settling down. And as they settle down, you see a growth in society. You have a bigger surplus, you have groups coming together and enlarging, and you see more distinctive rulership. And this is one Yayoi settlement recreation. This is Yoshinogari. It's in northern Kyushu, so right across the straits from Korea. And you can see that this is a more significant settlement than the isolated pit dwellings that were found in the Jomon, though I don't sadly have a picture of those. And you might also tell from these, this is a pretty fortified settlement. We have walls, we have a guard tower, there is a moat. So this suggests that this is a really violent time. And I think it's likely that as people are settling down and land becomes a commodity, you have increasing violence. So people are no longer able to move away from threats, they're fixed to the land. And because land is a commodity, you need to have land that is easily irrigated through natural means. They don't yet have paddy techniques, so you have to have low-lying land near water to grow rice. It's really significant to control that. Yeah.
When you said pit dwellings, you mean they dug a pit and then did they put something over the top of it?
Yes, so they would dig a pit several feet down and they'd put in pillars, mostly tree trunks, and they'd build up from that. But it's kind of similar to a teepee in the way that it would work with an open vent at the top and layers for ventilation to get flue for smoke.
So this is way different.
This is way different. So this is more of a continental style. You'd see these kinds of buildings in Korea and you see them around in Japan for some time. So access to the continent was critical. So obviously a lot of these people and ideas came from the continent. So you have new ideas on architecture. You're going to have significant linguistic influence. You start to see some archaeological finds that with writing in this period. And you have the earliest written record of Japan. A Chinese embassy came probably to northern Kyushu. It's still debated. Either they came to northern Kyushu or to central Japan near Kyoto. And they recorded some sort of ethnographic remarks on the Japanese people there. That it's more egalitarian than Chinese society, that it's less stratified. Well, I suppose that's the same. You have ritual specialists, that you have a woman and man in charge. The female is in charge of ritual and the male in charge of politics. They have very low crime, and a lot of people have facial tattoos, are some of the more colorful remarks. So moving to the next period, the Cofilin Period. It's about 300 to 645, and these are pretty loose dates. Kofun are these giant tombs, and they started a little bit before this and lasted a little bit after. So the last ones are probably in the 8th century or so, maybe even into the 9th. But as these communities like Yoshinogari grew and had more members, the rulership became more distinctive, and as they came to possess more control over labor and more specialization, they built these great monoliths to honor themselves, basically. So this is the biggest one in Japan. It's bigger than the pyramids. It's the biggest tomb known to man. The Chinese Qin Shi Huang's tomb might be bigger, but because they haven't discovered all of it yet, this one remains the biggest. This is near Osaka. It's Emperor Nintoku's tomb. And for reference, that's about, what, 5 city blocks long? It's really massive. Yeah?
It's terraced, and is that water?
Yes, that's a moat around it. So these are often called keyhole tombs. So you can sort of see the resemblance with a circle and triangle base. And then they have a moat around it, and then often a wooded area. And this was by design. This is a really significant engineering feat. Here's another one where this is a more traditional dolmen. And you see types like this all over Korea. But it's a pretty big deal in terms of engineering. I don't know enough about it to give you every step of the process, but essentially it involves piling up, leveling a plane, piling up rocks, using different kinds of rocks to build up while creating a central chamber. Then putting in these pots was a method of irrigating. What is the word I want? They essentially are going to use it so that they have a drainage system so that it doesn't get eroded or just become a lake entirely, and they set up a moat around it. And we find these guys. These are haniwa, these clay figurines, of which I had imagined there are some here. We find these in there often, perhaps as votive sacrifices. There's an entry in the history saying that these were used instead of human sacrifice. This is a warrior, but often they were used as drainage statues. Yeah.
Were these tombs left pretty much in place, or had they all been covered over and had to be excavated? And also, were they pillaged?
Very good questions. Mostly they have been left in place. There are dozens of them throughout Japan, although they are clustered in political centers. So you find these all over, and their size often is indicative of the political power. You have more labor, you have better engineering. So in northern Kyushu and in central Japan and along the inland sea, you see these most often, but you see them elsewhere as well. They even make it as far east as Tokyo. They've mostly been left because they're, these giant hills with a lot of rocks surrounded by a moat. They don't make for good farmland, so they mostly weren't converted, but it's hard to say. If they were, we wouldn't have a record of it. Some of them have been excavated, but mostly not. They're actually under the domain of the Imperial Household Agency, which is notoriously jealous of opening these up for fear of what they might find, I think. With modern DNA testing, you could test the DNA of the remains to see who they most closely resemble, and my personal guess is that they would be very closely related to Koreans, because you have a lot of migration coming from the Korean peninsula, and it's very, very likely that the royal family has a significant amount of Korean blood. So if these are in fact the emperors, and there's no way of knowing that they are, some later ones where you have contemporary writing, you can date them pretty well, but these earlier ones, it's almost legendary. And some they even find multiple people, both with crowns on, which I don't know what to make of. Maybe it's different generations, I'm not sure. But so it's still an archaeological project in process, and it may never be fully undertaken because of the Imperial Household Agency foot dragging. So we have this, so I mentioned there's a lot of shared blood, we have shared culture. It's in this period that Buddhism is introduced to Japan, nominally in the year 552. That's according to the Japanese record, but probably a little bit earlier than that. And with Buddhism, of course, comes writing, because it comes in a written text in a sutra. And so you have this greater connection with the continent. You now have shared blood, culture, religion, writing, in addition to architecture and any number of other things, agriculture. However, you still have, even as people are coming in, they're building these great monuments, a lot of violence. And this is not all-encompassing violence where it's hugely high casualty rates, but it's very frequent violence. And the main cause of this is succession disputes. So you have these different clans, probably chiefdoms at this point, that are becoming sort of regional confederations, and they're not yet unified. You have many clans. One of them is the future imperial line, but many other clans that are about similar in power. Eventually, the imperial family becomes the imperial family, but they're really rulers only in name. They're about it's the first among equals type situation. They have power over the other clans only as far as the other clans agree that they have power. So they can't really compel all of them to change or to do anything. It takes compromise and negotiation to get these political changes done. As a result, there's no succession system. The imperial family, the succession's limited to this line, but it can go to anyone. It can go to a son, a younger brother, a cousin, an uncle, a daughter, a wife. It could go in any direction practically, and it does. There's no system, there's no idea that the oldest male gets to become heir, or that even if you're dividing property, that it goes only to one heir. And because of this, whenever an emperor dies, there's a significant amount of uncertainty and often bloodshed. So we'll come back to the bloodshed. It's always fun. My undergraduate research was on violence, which maybe we'll show through. I was very interested in the role of violence in the formation of Japanese states, because it's really important, but it's actually quite isolated, I think, and we'll come back to that. It's a theme I like to talk about. So let's see, a couple more things. The grave goods I neglected to mention. You can see more continental connections. So in addition to these haniwa, you'd also have bronze mirrors, which were a sign of political authority, which no doubt you guys have seen. You see horse trappings, jewelry, weapons, a lot of metal objects. Of course, these are the ones that last the best, but they're also signs, they have utilitarian purposes, a weapon, for instance, but they're also prestige goods. So not only does this show that you have a connection to the continent, but that shows that you are in power in Japan. And it's likely that archaeological historians have theorized that there's a network of these goods, such that they're distributed from regional centers out. And you can find, you can trace some of the trade routes from bigger tombs to smaller ones. Toward the end of this period, we have one clan become most powerful. It's not the imperial family, it's the Soga, which is another rival clan. And they come to dominate politics and control the court, and even in the late 6th century have one of the emperors killed so they can put up a more favorable candidate. So it's pretty audacious. But it's never quite as cut and dry as that. These aren't just bad people. They're a big family. They're not uniform at all. In fact, they had several emperors. Empress Sui Ko, who's a young woman, ruled in the early 7th century with the help of her nephew, Prince Shotoku, who is like a patron saint of Japan, who's said to have essentially founded Japanese Buddhism. And this temple near Nara, Horyuji, which is nominally the oldest wood building in the world, but really it has one really old board in it. They've done kind of dental work repairs, so they take out one piece at a time, so you can go see this one like 1,400-year-old board. But pretty neat, and he is obviously held in high regard. He's been on money. And together they instituted a set of reforms known as the 17-Article Constitution, where they tried to sort of reorient the state along Confucian and Buddhist lines, which was not in the interest of the Soga. It was trying to strengthen the center. So it's not as easily done as this, although the Soga didn't like this very much. They continued to dominate politics until 645, when you have a coup. And this is one of the big turning points of early Japanese history that Andrea mentioned. The Taika coup and the Taika reforms, meaning Taika means big change, Taika. They were undertaken by an imperial prince who went on to be an emperor, and by the Nakatomi family, who's a Soga rival, who later became the Fujiwara and dominant. So they killed the Soga leader in the throne room in front of the emperor, then went to their house and killed the other Soga men. So as a political faction, they're done. That's no more Soga. And we have a reorganization of the government along Tang Chinese lines. And so Andrea mentioned this. I'll go into a little bit of detail, but you could talk all day about the Ritsuryo system. It's great. So they have this system that they borrow from China, and I think there are a number of factors that led to this. I'd say one, that they have access to this really advanced system of government, which is unusual because they're next door to this giant, yet they're not taken over yet. That's another thing. They're fighting in Korea on behalf of a Korean ally in the 660s, and they lose terribly. They're really worried about a Chinese invasion, so there's another reason to help centralize power for national defense. And third, I'd say just cynically, it's about power. This is a good chance to solidify control and to subordinate rivals. They've already killed some of them. You know, this is not a time for half measures. It's time to consolidate their control. And so a big part of this is by centralizing administration and creating a new bureaucracy. And so a lot of that is having state control over land, at least nominally, which is then distributed out to the people based on population censuses. So they go around, write down everyone's name, and they give everyone land, man, women, and children age, I think, 6 and up, although women get, 2/3 of the land of men? And there's actually thinking behind why it's 2/3. It's not just because they're women, but because men have added tax burdens of corvée labor and military service. So as Andrea mentioned, they have a conscription army for about 150 years. And the tax rates are actually pretty low on the land. It's like 3 to 5% plus the special products. And then if you're a man, corvée and military service, which is a couple years. And these are pretty successful. You have a new law code, and they actually bring in the old aristocracy into this. And as I mentioned, this is first among equal situations, so they're only able to bring these people in by convincing them that it's in their best interests. They give them plush new jobs, new ranks, extra privileges, and through these sort of little corruptions, they're able to bring them into the new system. So even though you had the shiny new Chinese system, it never really functions to the letter of the law, not from the beginning. And over time, we'll see a sort of slow erosion of it. They also have state history projects. So this is a depiction on the right of one of the legends of Japanese creation. This is Amaterasu, the sun goddess, coming out of her cave so that her sun can shine on the Japanese people again. And this is when they write their first histories. The Nara period is when governance happens in Nara. It's pretty straightforward. They move to a permanent capital in 710. Previously, in the Asuka period and earlier, they had moved palaces with every emperor after they died, either for reasons of ritual pollution or because they weren't architecturally sound. They're building with a lot of wood, so they do decline quite rapidly. So it's a big investment to build such a city. Yeah?
Where do they get their alphabet from?
Their alphabet? From China. So at this point, there isn't an alphabet yet. They have Chinese characters, which they use to write Kambun, or at this point, perhaps even before that, sort of like a Sino-Japanese hybrid, but it's practically writing in classical Chinese. So at this point, they're restricted to that, but they're working on it. Starting in this period, you have Buddhist institutions getting set up more widely. You have 6 sects in Nara, and an offshoot of one of these sects, which will be introduced in the next period, helps to pioneer the alphabet. Though how exactly, I am not entirely clear on. There's a very dense book about it that I don't like very much. So you have these great new buildings of state. We have a palace, of course, at the north, at the top. We have a number of administrative buildings within the palace grounds. We have this nice gridded, about 8-mile square city with ordered, numbered avenues, and these black squares at the bottom are the east and west markets. It's a very organized city. And we do see something of a cultural flowering. We have Nara Buddhism. We have the first imperial, well, I suppose not technically imperial, imperially influenced poetry anthology, the Manyoshu. And we get to see the rise of Buddhist interests and aristocrats. So increasingly, the emperor is not in power. He's going to be influenced more and more by these outside forces. And at the end of the period, in 792, we have the end of conscription. So the Japanese state fought a series of very costly wars in the northeast against some native peoples. Costly both in the sense that it was really, really expensive for these, and it cost a lot of time and money. And so instead of fighting it with conscription forces, these are peasants forced to fight that don't want to be there, they just want to get back to their farm. They've switched to professional warriors who are hereditarily trained and can ride horses. So last year we talked, they had for the middle school teachers, they had a prompt, well, why does the curved sword matter in Japanese history? Such as it does, this is why it matters. They switched to a curved sword, actually copying the native peoples so that they could fight them more efficiently, and they fought on horseback. Yeah?
The native people were the Ainu?
That's a good question. It's debated. I think the consensus now is that they were called by the Japanese the Ezo or Emishi early on, and the Ainu may have been a sort of cultural and genetic fusion some centuries later as people migrated from Siberia southeast. But they are probably ancestors of the Ainu, and they were in the east getting pushed steadily back. And this, well, we'll come back to it. It's very expensive, and that's a significant factor. And here we have Todaiji. This is one of the big temples built in Nara. It's the biggest wooden building in the world, and this is the great Buddha inside it. And you can see some of the people there. It's really, really big. Nara was abandoned as a capital in favor of Heian in 794. This is modern Kyoto. In part because of political rivalry within the imperial line. There were different factions. One faction won out and moved the capital because it was the ancestral home of the other line. But this is all one family, of course. Nice and messy. In the Heian period, we started to see the decline of imperial power in Nara. In the Heian period, we see the rise of the regency. So the Fujiwara family, this is the family that had helped in the coup in Taika a couple hundred years before, now effectively takes over government by becoming imperial regents. So they rule, if the emperor is underage, they have one title as regent, and if the emperor is of age, they have another title as regent. So the emperor is effectively removed from power. And they're able to continue this domination through marriage politics. So typically Fujiwara men competing within the Fujiwara, so brothers competing against brothers, to marry their daughters into the imperial family so that their son-in-laws might become emperors, and then their grandsons could be emperors. And Fujiwara Michinaga is probably the height of Fujiwara power around the year 1000. He had 4 daughters marry emperors and 3 imperial grandchildren. Yeah, and he uses this power to great effect. In this period, you really start to see the hollowing out of the economic base. We've already seen some privileges, but this is when the estate system, such as there is a system, begins, where using their political influence in the capital, top-level aristocrats or temples can shield certain lands from taxes and even entry from state officials. So state officials can not only not collect taxes, they can't enter the grounds of the land to police, collect criminals, any other reason. So increasingly, they're drawing on these lands. They have alliances with local nobles, so provincial nobles, who help pass these lands on to them. And these provincial nobles recruit cultivators to pass their land up. And it's really a win-win-win situation for everyone involved. Yeah?
Would you say that this era is kind of the start of the feudal system for Japan?
I think traditionally that's how it's been viewed. I don't like calling it feudal because
You were dealing with 7th graders
Yeah, probably. It's very, very similar to the feudal system in that you have an exchange of land rights for considerations. Yeah, so it's definitely a quid pro quo in that the cultivators are giving some of the income rights. They still retain the rights to the land itself, but some of the income rights they pass up this chain in a way very similar. And as we incorporate warriors into this, it looks a lot like the feudal system. So, and that's.
Has always been, you know, the textbooks for the 7th graders, we study feudal Japan, but it doesn't really talk about how the system evolved. Suddenly they just start, you know, in the middle.
Yeah.
So I've always been curious how it kind of gradually evolved
So,
to its height.
it sort of hollows out from the 8th century. So almost as soon as they institute the system, they start making allowances. And first for temples, and then later aristocrats using their political power can get their own exemptions. And then they can recruit people to, and sometimes they come unrecruited, to commend lands to them. And you know, by the 14th, 15th century, it's like half of lands have been converted to this estate. And so that helps, you know, we're trying to pay for all these wars in the Northeast. We have an expensive state. It gets harder and harder to run it. And so increasingly, and eventually in the 11th, 12th centuries, the imperial family turns to doing this itself. And they have the retired emperor, which is the position they make up, so that they can wield power similar to the aristocratic households, does the same thing. And so, as I mentioned, this is beneficial to all parties involved, but not the state. This is really bad for the state. So there's often been sort of dichotomy drawn between public and private interests. And you know, I'd like to poke at it and complicate it a little bit, but mostly it's pretty accurate. That you have this public system set up, and it needs to be staffed by bureaucrats and administrators who are going to look out for the public good. But much like a congressional regulatory committee that has a bunch of industry members on it, they hollow it out very quickly. So the regulations are stripped, tax exemptions are given out, and they line their own pockets. However, this wealth is put to some wonderful use. This is the height of classical Japanese culture. So we see the aristocratic splendor. So here's one of the villas in Uji, owned by the Fujiwara. And this funds the tale of Genji and the Pillow Book, these wonderful pieces of Japanese literature, which are of course written in the new alphabet, pioneered in the 9th and 10th centuries. Partly through these new esoteric Buddhist sects.
Does Fujiwara have to do with Mount Fuji?
It does not. It's the same sound but different characters. Fujiwara, it means wisteria plain. Wisteria, like the flower. They have, actually at this, I wish I had a different picture. At this villa, they have wonderful wisteria garden. If you go in summer, it's really phenomenal. And let's see, we also have the idea of mappo, which is the idea that the world is entering a degenerate stage of the Buddhist law. So the Buddhism is being forgotten and that the world is in inexorable decline. And so this is a sutra container that aristocrats would commission the copying of sutras to accrue merit. And they would bury them in these containers in the hillsides for future generations, so when they've lost the word of Buddha, they can find them. And yeah. Yeah, there's a scroll in it. So they'd have a sutra copied out, or one part of a sutra copied out in the scroll. Yeah.
So what was causing them to anticipate end times, basically? Like what was happening society-wise?
In terms of society, actually things are going really well for the most part.
So what would they
There's
get?
prolonged peace. The aristocrats have never been richer and more powerful. It comes from, I don't know the doctrinal source, but it comes from these new sects that are preaching this.
Oh, okay.
But I beyond that, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. And it's interesting. Mappo, M-A-P-P-O, long O. Yeah, and it sort of pervades things. There's a nice, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but there's a nice sense of it in the Tale of the Heike, which is a medieval war tale, which starts with the sound of the Gion Shoja echoes the impermanence of all things. The color of the Sala flowers, what is it? Reveals the truth that the prosperous must decline. The proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The mighty fall at last. They are like dust before the wind. Yeah, it's this great opening line, but it's big on impermanence and decline. Yeah.
Spell that?
The tale of
Heike, H-E-I-K-E. And here's, well, the next slide This is from the Tale of Genji. These are some later screens. This is a screen of a scene from the Tale of Heike, a very famous one. And the Tale of the Heike, let's just jump in. It covers this series of skirmishes, you could call it a war. It is national in scale in that it happens all over the place, between two rival warrior factions. In the 1150s, we have different fighting in the capital, two factions against each other, then the winning faction splits and fights again, and you essentially have one warrior ascendant who is allied to the top political figures, aristocrats and retired emperors. He becomes the most powerful man in Japan for about a year. And because he becomes so powerful, like we saw with the Soga before, when there's a new balance of power, you're going to have new resistance. And so there's a new coalition of people that move against him, including the Minamoto, who are ultimate victors in this. And it's not, as clean as saying Minamoto versus Taira, but that's the gist of it. So you have these fights across the country, mostly local disputes sort of coalesce into this bigger fight, and the Taira are removed from power. So the Minamoto win in the Tale of Heike. And Heike is another word for Taira, another pronunciation. So it's the decline of the Taira house, and such, the emphasis on decline. You have the warriors that win, the Minamoto, establish a new, I would call it branch government in Kamakura in the east, where they take up the duties that the imperial state's no longer able to provide. So they weren't able to provide defense. They got rid of conscription long ago. They're not able to police. They're not even allowed to enter a lot of estates. And so the warriors sort of pick up that mantle and become the state's policemen, but a really corrupt policeman. So this is all about self-interest. They assign warriors as rewards positions onto estates, and they're able to then extract a certain percentage or a certain amount of revenue from these estates and nominally keep the order. Of course, these are the people that disrupt the order, so it's, yeah. Step forward for two back, I suppose, as far as keeping the order. So you get a little bit more disorder in this period after a long Heian peace. You also get some new Buddhism. We have the introduction of Zen. The reintroduction of Zen is now an independent sect, which is supported by the warriors in Kamakura. And we have Amidism sects that are really popular with the masses. And they preach salvation for everyone, and that you don't need to have monastic discipline. You don't need to have the resources of an aristocrat to be saved. That all you have to say is the Nembutsu. If you say Namu Amida Butsu, you're expressing your faith in the Amida Buddha, and you will be saved. And so I really like this sculpture. My art history is not great, but I really like this one. And this is a itinerant monk reciting the Nembutsu, represented as these people walking out of his mouth. Let's see. So we also have a spread of warrior culture as they make alliances across the country, these sort of horizontal warrior alliances. And yeah, we have the Tale of Heike is written down and spread by itinerant monks and storytellers, often blind players of the biwa. And it becomes very popular, nationally known, even played at imperial parties. So it appeals to everyone, essentially. And I suppose lastly, we have the Mongol invasions, which are always exciting. The Mongols, perhaps the greatest empire the earth has ever seen, invaded Japan twice, and twice did not succeed. And they were repulsed in large part by a series of typhoons called the kamikaze, which is the origin of the term. It means divine wind. And these supposedly, according to certain Buddhist sects, they came in response to their prayers. Or maybe because it was typhoon season and they didn't record how the weather patterns worked, and the Mongols weren't sailors. They had forced Koreans mobilized to sail for them. This was not the best plan. Whatever the reason, it didn't work. And we have this lovely scroll which shows the Mongols using gunpowder, commissioned actually by a samurai to show that he fought and that he was injured, so he needs rewards. And gimme, gimme, gimme. This is a big problem for the government, which is increasingly having trouble doling out rewards. So when it took over, when it beat the Taira, they had a lot of lands to give out. When you beat the Mongols who are invading, you get nothing. And so this is a problem, and increasingly there's problems with the samurai losing their land. So increasingly they're impoverished, and more people are getting upset, and then blammo, revolution. You have at first an imperial revolution, a restoration of imperial rule, but it is very quick. It only lasts for 3 years before the new emperor is overthrown by his top general. So you sort of get what you pay for with traitorous generals. He got him to betray his former lords to join him, and then when the opportunity was good, he betrayed him and set up his own shop. And he established the next warrior government, the Muromachi government, It's returned to Kyoto, and it's on the Muromachi Street, which is why it's called Muromachi. Ashikaga is the family name, it's another name for the period. And at this point, you can really call it a warrior government. The central government, the imperial government, is no longer doing very much because the warriors have moved back into Kyoto, and as the aristocrats' land rights are sort of slowly eaten up by the warriors. So we had these estates, and the warriors are inserted in Kamakura into the equation as middlemen, essentially, and they just take up more and more. So by this period, you have aristocrats appealing to the warriors for just a division. So for some time now, the warriors had set up courts to hear grievances, and this is something I'm very interested in, but can't talk about very much right now because it'll take a while. So they set up a law code, they set up courts to hear grievances about their own vassals, and eventually, aristocrats don't see it as worthwhile to keep pressing their cases. They just want to divide their land and give the warriors half. So giving away half their land is seen as desirable, so it's getting pretty bad. And as the aristocrats lose power, the warriors sort of fill in the vacuum, but central power shrinks. Increasingly, the warrior government has to rely on their vassals, these military governors, out in the provinces to keep order, but they either lose control over the governors or the governors lose control of their men, and more you see local control happening. So the area under central control shrinks. So even at the beginning of the period, it was probably limited to just the main island, just the Honshu. Toward the end of the period, it's limited to just the areas around Kyoto. And in 1467, they can't control Kyoto. Before we get to that, we see more and more warrior cultures. So I mentioned the war tales, and Andrea had mentioned No. This is when No really explodes into the provinces. And this is a No mask. I believe this was made in the 19th century, but it's in a similar spirit to the original ones. And through warrior patronage of Zen, you see an influx of Chinese culture. And the warriors are also quite interested in trade with China because increasingly that's their moneymaker. And this is a Chinese-style ink painting done in this period in Japan. We also have some really interesting architecture. So this is Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, which is created in the 15th century. This is what's happening while their world is falling apart. And we have Ryoanji, the famous rock garden around the turn of the 16th century, I think, maybe earlier. But this is the new Zen dry garden. So in 1467, we have this dispute in a number of warrior families that sort of coalesces into this, that I wanted to use a word that would not be appropriate, into this big problem. And so they have a dispute over essentially titles and succession and name calling that sort of snowballs into a war. And it takes 10 years. So nothing like this has ever happened in Japanese history before. There's never been such sustained fighting with such high casualty rates for so long and so much destruction. Kyoto is burned down. And this is essentially, even though the war ends after 10 years accomplishing very little, that's the end of the central government for all intents and purposes. And it's complete decentralization. So we have the rise of local warriors. Some of them shugo, the provincial governors from previously. Some other local warriors who grew up there. They take over local control and run their own areas autonomously. And this is a very popular era. This is a lot of video games and movies and novels set in this time because it's a very dynamic time with a lot of fighting. I'm not going to get into it too much. This is also when Christianity is introduced, which comes in 1543. Also guns. And Christianity has a sort of checkered relationship with Japanese authority figures. Some embrace it as seeing a way to better their relations with Westerners, get more access to critically guns and other trade goods, maybe better ships. Others reject it entirely because having this Christian God be the ultimate authority is a challenge to their own power. And ultimately that's what happens. The latter stance wins out. But ultimately, this only happens with unification. So unification begins with Oda Nobunaga, who is a terrifying man. You might call him a sociopath. He elevates this war, which is already total war. The tax rates are much higher. They're trying to extract as much as they can from their domain because it's such a predatory environment that if you don't consume your neighbors, they'll consume you. So you see this slow consolidation of domains. Nobunaga takes this to a new level because if you're not with him, you're against him, and he will destroy you until there's nothing left. So most famously, he was betrayed by a group of monks on a very famous mountain near Kyoto, and he burned it down. He took an army, surrounded the mountain, and walked up and killed everyone, something like 30,000 people. He is incredibly brutal. And it's this environment that he creates that allows the end of this period. It takes a very long time. It's 100-some years before there's unification. But he's killed by one of his generals. This is also a theme. Another of his generals takes up the mantle of unification, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And he is able to, with this specter of annihilation looming, convince his rivals to make peace. But it's a very interesting peace. This is not a centralized peace, as you might expect, but it's more of a federal peace. He brings people in, they retain most of their powers as long as they submit to him. And they're kept mostly as equals. He even increases some of the lands held by his main rivals. However, he dies, and his heir is only 5 years old at the time. So yeah, that's the end of his line. One of his rivals, another of the generals of Nobunaga, whose land he increased, overthrows him. And here's a picture of Hideyoshi on the left. And here is I don't know what to call it, a joke, an adage, about the unification period. And they say that for unification, Nobunaga made the dough, and here he is pounding the mochi dough. Hideyoshi made the cake, and you can see him working the cake. And then Ieyasu, Tokugawa, ate it. And so he's the one that ultimately gets the unification of Japan complete. You could argue that Hideyoshi does, but it doesn't last for very long. Tokugawa essentially takes the Hideyoshi settlement and makes it his own with a few modifications. So you now have sort of a quasi-centralized control in Edo, which is going to be Tokyo later in the east. And this brings us to the Edo period, where you have control over certain things like punishment of the daimyo, these domainal lords, control of finance, diplomacy, etc. But largely, local control is still intact. There are certain checks on it. They can remove the lords. They can punish them by reducing their domain. They can make them move to a different domain if they're getting too cozy with neighbors. There are a number of checks, but for the most part, local rule is maintained. And this is in part, much like we saw early on with the imperial house as the first among equals, because I would say it's impossible to govern Japan as a unified whole before the railroad and the telegraph. I don't think it could be done. Because of the geography of Japan, there's so many mountain ranges, so little arable land, so spread out, it's impossible to communicate quickly. It's very difficult to have a centralized government alone. So you have a sort of a federal system instead here. We also see a flowering of urban culture here. As these lords set up castle towns, they had one castle per domain. They set up these towns. On the whole, probably millions of people moved into them. This is a significant boom in urbanization. Previous to this point, there are maybe 4 cities in Japan. After 50 years, there are about 60. So there are a lot of new cities. And these have a lot of commoner merchant culture, which started a bit earlier in the period of disunity. Tea culture flourishes, for instance. We have new styles of print, ukiyo-e, like these, which also focus on the pleasure quarters, which is increasingly popular. We have kabuki emerges, and travel takes off, and we have new kinds of poetry, haiku, for instance. Like my favorite haiku is by Basho, the famous poet, which is, "An ancient pond, the frog jumps in, splash." And there are a million ways. If you Google Basho frog, you can probably find it. There are pages that just have dozens and dozens of translations. It need not be 575 for a haiku. You can capture the spirit of the translation. Right. There is a class system, supposedly rigid, which you can call spam, which is the samurai at the top, and the peasants, artisans, and merchants, which is nominally a very rigid system, but in reality, within each class, you have haves and haves not. So you'll have very rich samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants, as well as very poor ones in each. And there's some cooperation between those at the top of each class. So it's not as rigid a hierarchy as it would seem. This is also the period where we have the way of the warrior becomes this thing in a time of profound peace. So in the 250 plus years, there's one incident of violence of any note. There's one rebellion early on, and the 47 Ronin kill an old man at night. It's much dramatized, but really not that significant an act of violence. There's huge population growth along with urbanization in the city and the countryside, as well as economic growth. Population growth subsides after the 17th century as there's family planning in the countryside. It's actually been, I've been convinced with demographic evidence that this is effective birth control through infanticide and family planning that helped keep family size small, which is ideal for farmers so they can invest more in their land. And there are limits to how big the cities could get. Edo was 1 million people in 1700. So it just couldn't be that much bigger given the constraints of technology at the time. However, as much as this population leveled off, I would argue it's not really stagnation so much as preparation for modernization. It's this investment earlier on that allows for modernization in Meiji. The Meiji Restoration occurs in 1868. It's led by a group of lower and middle ranking samurai discontent with the government. They're from domains rival to the Tokugawa, and they help overthrow the government. Interestingly enough, the last shogun, you'd expect the guillotine or something along these lines. He resigns, he quits. They give him a stipend, he gets an estate in the country. He starts wearing a top hat. It was pretty easy. There's a little bit of fighting, but it's mostly bloodless. And this is called an aristocratic revolution often, because it's done by members of the samurai class, and these are nominally at the top of the social order, with very little support from peasants, artisans, or merchants. Some merchants made some loans, but they also often had to make loans at the point of a sword. So you can read more into that than there might be. This revolution was in large part in response to domestic unrest. You have increasing inflation and samurai poverty. A lot of these lower-ranking samurai are unable to provide for themselves because they're paid in rice, and rice has lost much of its value as production has gone up with this increasing investment in agriculture. And these are exacerbated by international concerns. The West arrives in 1853. The Americans show up with Commodore Perry and his gunboats, his black ships. And they effectively open Japan, signing the first of several unequal treaties. And Japan essentially gives up extraterritoriality and tariff controls to foreigners. So they can't impose their law on foreigners or control their trade with foreigners, which is pretty significant. But critically, Japan was never colonized. And only Japan and Thailand in Asia were not, counting China as semi-colonized. And certainly looking at China's experience in the Opium War, there was the possibility of very bad things happening to Japan. So did you have a question? Oh, all right. So with the Meiji Restoration, we have a political realignment. We have this sort of cohort of lower middle samurai that form a new oligarchy. And their mission, above all, is modernization. So they have a motto, Fukoku Kyohei, which is a rich country, strong army. And so their idea is to modernize, to build a strong economy, to build a strong military, and from there to repeal the unequal treaties and gain international recognition as a first-rate nation. So a lot of the economic reforms are done on the backs of teenage girls. So the biggest industry in Japan at the time was silk production, and they set up silk factories, and these are mostly done by teenage women.
What factory?
Silk spinning. So they increasingly had, in the Edo period, there was more and more commercial crops producing for market. And so they were already producing a lot of silk, but with the introduction of modern techniques, they could spin a lot more. It's no longer done in the cottage, but in an industrial urbanized factory. So production goes up quite a bit. These women are working in hellish conditions for very little pay, but are sent by their families to do so for a number of years before marriage often. And this helps fund the government's projects elsewhere. Some of these projects are heavy investment in heavy industry and a very cozy relationship with big business, and investment also in education and the military. And education and the military are also critical components of nationalization. By having everyone on the same educational standard, everyone for the first time in Japanese history learns the same Japanese language. They teach standard Japanese, which is a Tokyo dialect, becomes standard for the first time. People can actually talk to each other. Well, the Japanese language is, the differences in dialect, I would say, are not as different as Chinese dialects. They can be mutually unintelligible from the far north to the far south. Of course, the written language is all the same. And then through conscription, they built not only a sort of national spirit, but by bringing all men of a certain age for 3 years, I think, into the army, they create something of a melting pot where people are exposed to each other and they can diffuse new ideas. All right, so I think a big part of, and here we have, this is an early Western merchant from before the Meiji Restoration, and here we have after the Meiji Restoration, a woman in traditional dress with new electric lighting. I should have gotten some more. There's some really nice prints of early Yokohama, which was a treaty port created essentially for Western trade, where they had the first trains, and the Japanese really like trains. So tied to this idea of international recognition and the rich country, strong army is empire. And so the Japanese empire began, I suppose, technically in 1895, following the Sino-Japanese War. Japan went to war with China, easily won. It's a very embarrassing defeat for China that was supposed to be modernizing. And they took Taiwan and a huge war indemnity that paid for the war. And so everyone in Japan thought imperialism's awesome, we get stuff, we don't have to pay for anything, very low cost of life and no cost economically. So people were pretty happy with imperialism. And the oligarchs felt vindicated. In 1877, maybe you guys have seen The Last Samurai. There's a rebellion by one of the samurai oligarchs, the former samurai oligarchs, when they're repealing samurai privilege. And the movie, you can obviously trust Tom Cruise. The movie portrays it as this really romantic rebellion of the old spirit of the warrior, and this is not the case at all. The leader was Saigo Takamori. He was an oligarch. He was a modernizer. He had epaulettes. They had their last stand with swords because they ran out of gunpowder. It was certainly very romanticized after it, and he was made into a folk hero. But at the time, he just wanted to invade Korea. That was his main goal. And the other oligarchs wouldn't let him. And so he withdrew from the government, and through a series of accidents, essentially some of his disciples decided that they were going to raid the arsenal. That started the rebellion. So it was hardly this romantic, idealist stand. But the oligarchs said no in 1877, but they said yes to war in the 1890s. And it went pretty well for them, aside from the fact that it's essentially an unprovoked war. They were responding to Chinese help of Korea because Japan was trying to exert influence in Korea. Of course, Japan was unable to continue to exert influence in Korea because Korea didn't like that and turned to the Russians for help. So the Russians sort of filled in the vacuum left by the Chinese vacancy. And in 1904, 1905, Japan fought with Russia. And this is I believe it's a postcard, or perhaps an illustration, of the naval battle off Tsushima in the Korean Strait. And this is one of the greatest naval victories of all time, according to naval scholars. The Japanese capped the T against the Russians, so they maximized the number of guns they could have pointing at the Russian boats, while the Russians minimized the number of guns they could have pointing at the Japanese boats, and their fleet was destroyed. So this was a huge deal because it's the first time a non-Western power has unseated a European giant. And this does gain Japan some of the international recognitions it wants. It also is able to exert influence in Korea, which it annexes 5 years later. But they don't get the money for it. They don't get an indemnity because of the negotiated peace. Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for the treaty, but Japan's very unhappy. There are a number of riots in the cities because people got accustomed to this more easy imperialism. And this is all tied to the idea of security. So the idea that you need to have both military and economic security. So there was a very real threat of colonialism, and the Western powers were closing in on East Asia. So Japan thought it needs to have a buffer. They were told by one of the Prussian advisors that they hired a number of Western advisors, that Korea was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. So they had to do something about it. They had to make that part of their sphere of influence. So this is what prompted these two wars. But once they had this safe military buffer, they can start to bring it into their economy. And they use Korea as a breadbasket and source of other raw materials to help supply the industrializing heartland. And once they have a buffer, their buffer needs a buffer. And that buffer also needs a buffer. And this snowballs to the 1930s when you have the army staging incidents to invade China, first in Manchuria in 1931 and then China proper in 1937. This is helped at home by the failure of liberalism, as some call it. There was an experiment with party rule and liberal policies in the late teens and early 20s. But I think you can also see it as just bureaucratic rule. Some bureaucrats trained in the West experimented with liberalism, but then these same bureaucrats embraced the military takeover in the 30s as the people, mostly rural farmers, grew really tired with politicians who weren't helping them during the Depression. Being a farmer in modern Japan was tough. Taxes got a lot higher, a lot of people lost their lands, tenancy was a big issue, and people were very poor. and increasingly fed up with it during the Depression, as it seemed that there were still boom times in the cities as people starved in the countryside. This new alliance of the emperor and the military and the bureaucrats allowed for the militarization of the state, which ultimately led down the path to war. For time interests, I'm not going to cover much of the war. Japan ultimately thought that it needed to expand its resource base to break the stalemate it had fought into in China. And to this end, they tried attacking the Soviet Union. It didn't go very well. So they decided to declare war on the West and go for the colonies. And the idea was to do one big sweep, make the West see it's not worth fighting, and then live happily ever after as they continue to conquer China. That went very well until 1942, when America began its reconquest of the Pacific, and Midway is the turning point. And from there, things go downhill for Japan until 1945, where it is in ruins. You have about 3 million people killed in the war. It's 4% of the population. You have 9 million people homeless in 1945, a significant drop in the standard of living, over 60% drop in cities and 30% in the countryside. There are 6.5 million soldiers and colonists stranded abroad at the time of surrender. So Japan is completely wrecked. Political system is completely exposed. And the Americans come in for a 7-year occupation. It's nominally Allied occupation. It's really American. Here's the surrender on the USS Missouri. I don't think the symbolism was lost on the Japanese, as they had these ridiculous flyovers. The entire harbor is filled with American warships. Japan was rendered impotent next to American strength. And the US embarked on a political and economic makeover. They call it demilitarization, democratization. So they abolished the military. They wrote a new constitution which made Japan a pacifist nation. This is written by Americans, of course, in English. It begins with "we, the Japanese people," in this beautiful irony. But they have a pacifism clause that they're not allowed to have an army. They also democratize. They now have democratic elections, universal suffrage, separation of powers. For once, the military has civilian oversight, which there hadn't been previously. And there are a number of individual rights. So in addition to freedom, speech, religion, and religion actually is freedom of religion. Previously, it was in the Meiji Constitution, but state Shinto was I would call it a religion. The Japanese government did not call it a religion, so they could compel you to do it, because you can have freedom of religion, but you also have to do this. Now there's actual freedom of religion, and there's actually a gender equality clause in the Constitution. There were several women that were on the committee writing it, and in many ways more progressive than the American Constitution. They also undertook economic reforms, land reform, pro-labor reform, any number of things before, in '48, as the Cold War heated up, reversing course and cutting back on a lot of these reforms. So I think I need to finish. Japan grew a lot in the post-war. Japan Inc., it's often called. 10% growth for over a decade annually. They hosted the Olympics and unveiled the bullet train in 1964. By the 1980s, Japanese companies had bought Rockefeller Center and Columbia Pictures, were poised to become the greatest economic power in the world. We're going to overtake the US. We have Japan as #1. Now that they don't have those so much anymore. So in 1989, the real estate bubble burst, followed by a stock market crash. And this has often been known as the lost decade, the 90s. And then given the stagnant growth, there was another lost decade. So we're technically still in them, I suppose. So you do have a significant economic reduction. It's down to like 2% growth from 10% 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And you also have the graying and shrinking of society. Very low birth rate, people are getting older, population shrinking. I would argue, however, it's not all bad. You do have life expectancies continuing to go up. It's still the highest in the world, really high standard of living. You have great health care and infrastructure, good trains. Gotta love trains. Expanding consumer culture. Tokyo has more Michelin stars than any other city in the world. In your face, Paris. And the economy, well, it is not what it was in the 70s and 80s. It's still going strong. They still have a trade surplus, low unemployment, and a robust currency that they control. So I'd say it's still going pretty well. So a couple points to conclude. I'm sorry for the abbreviation. It's 12,000 years is a lot. So hopefully you guys got a sense of the bigger trends in Japanese history. And this is the standard periodization. It can give the impression of these really rigid ruptures with these great turning points. And there are indeed several really important turning points where a lot of things change. The Taika Reform in 645, the Unification in 1600, the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and defeat in 1945 are really game-changing moments. But don't let the rigid periodization with these nice lines drawn fool you. There's a lot of other stuff going on as well. Slow change is always a really important factor. I would argue more important than these big rupturous moments, but that's a matter of opinion. So as you have these continuations, you have slow changes. The Taika Reform, it establishes this new system, but it slowly gets hollowed out over time. And over hundreds of years, the estate system develops and essentially supplants it. Then after 100 years of decentralization, you finally bottom out with disorder. After 100 years of that, you've moved to unification. And these changes take time. They're very slow changes that are hard to put into boxes. Unfortunately, teaching history, my experience has been you have to put things into boxes. So this is my preferred way to do so with the political periodization, but with the qualifier that it's important to appreciate these other kinds of change as well. All right, 12,000 years done. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, when you said that term spam and you said samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants, were the samurai then at the top?
They were.
The peasants were?
The peasants were second. So it was this was a state supported by Neo-Confucian thinking, and in that, to govern was the highest calling, and that's how the samurai legitimized their rule. But of course, the next highest was farming. This is a very noble calling, and so they were the next highest up, even if most of them were very poor and often essentially tenants.
And one other question.
Yeah.
What was the name of that prince? Started with a T, I think, that you kind of called the patron saint?
Shotoku, Shotoku. Sorry, I'll add more writing next time. And the samurai class I'd add is very top-heavy. It's 6 to 8% of the population as a ruling class. This is really large, and it turns out unsustainably so. Yeah.
So there must have been a shift from that notion that the merchants were at the bottom. Like when I think of European, like the bourgeoisie, they would have been on the second rung.
Right.
Second, third rung, in the second.
Yeah.
But here they are at the bottom. Was it thought that they were bottom feeders, just making money off other people?
That was the thinking according to the Neo-Confucian thinkers.
And there were so few of them prior to urbanization that they just couldn't mount enough.
There weren't very many prior to urbanization, but beginning even before 1600, there's a lot of trade. Japan's a very dynamic place in the late period of country at war because there's no central power to curtail it. So there's a tremendous amount of trade with China and Europe. Japan actually produced in the 16th century more precious metal than Spanish Mexico. There's a ton of stuff going on. And so you see a huge growth in the merchant population. And it's probably during the Tokugawa period comparable to the samurai population. So between 5 and 10%. So they're growing, and they're growing in power. And increasingly, they are the ones backing all of the policies. They're the only ones with money. There are a handful of samurai that are able to modernize their domains much later, but for the most part, the period is marked by samurai decline, at least economically. And while they don't have the legitimacy in the official Neo-Confucian eyes, there is a nice study of a samurai academy, a merchant academy. I'm sure Andrea would be happy to tell you about it. It's her favorite book. That talks about how the merchants saw themselves, and they saw making profit and moving money around as virtuous, as it helped society. And so they had their own, at least this one merchant community in Osaka, had their own sense of how they were contributing and how they were a legitimate part of it. But you don't have a bourgeois like you have in Europe. This is one of the few questions I was able to answer on my exam. There is no bourgeois, and there's certainly no bourgeois revolution. That while there are merchants, that it's not in the same sense social or politically similar to Europe. Yeah.
You touched on a little bit, but could you maybe give some more resources of where you can find more information on women in Japanese history, particularly like feudalism and earlier history of Japan?
Nothing comes to mind off the top of my head. I know there's a project in the works by a professor who's writing 2 books, one on medieval women and one on medieval men, but she's been writing them for the better part of 2 decades. So I don't know when they're going to come out. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything specifically on women. There are a couple figures you could focus on early on. So the Emperor Sui Ko, you could certainly find in the national histories. There are chapters on her, which Suiko. And she's a major figure. She's one of the iconic early emperors. And there are a number of other early emperors through about the early 9th century, I'd say. She'd be a big one. You could look up Hojo, Hojo Masako, Masako, who was the wife of Minamoto Yoritomo, who's the founder of the first warrior government, and who was called the Nun Shogun, who took over many of his duties after his death and helped run the government along with her brother. Beyond that, I can't think of very much off the top of my head. I'll get back to you. But increasingly, as the warriors take over, women lose more and more ground. So in the Heian period, for instance, they had full property rights. They were writing all the time. There wasn't this patrilineal idea of marriage. The marriage was much less permanent. They had many more rights, but these are slowly stripped away from them. So by the time of the country at war, women are essentially used as pawns in marriage politics and little else. Yeah. There's a wonderful tradition of gender equality before.
I read about very briefly once. There was a kit that I used for teaching 7th grade Japan, and it talked a little bit about in early Japan the equality of women, but it really didn't give any details. So I was looking for more.
There's a good article on Heian marriage institutions by what's his name? McCullough. I forget his first name. What's his first name? William McCullough?
Yeah, I wrote a Wikipedia article on it.
Okay. And that's, I don't know, available on JSTOR, but we could put it up on, there's a wiki for this workshop, right? Yeah, I could put that up. Yeah, it's fairly dense, but it's got a lot of good stuff in there, and it's a corrective to another book that's The World of a Shining Prince that doesn't.
Summarize the bullet points for your students.
Yeah, if you just read the concluding couple of pages, you could probably break it down to 5 or 6 bullet points.
Can you send that to Sarah and ask her to put on?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know the first PowerPoint thing you had with the color-coded thing with the periods and
Yeah.
hunter-gatherer and the religion and all that. Is there a way we can get a copy? Yeah, that.
Yeah, I could put that up as well. Yeah.
And one more question.
Sure.
Does Japan have an army now?
They have, my answer is yes. Technically, no. They are, however, the 4th largest military budget in the world. They have a self-defense force. So part of this reverse course, and sorry, I glossed over it because I'm a pre-modernist, I'm a medievalist. I maybe paid a little bit too much attention to that. In the reverse course and in the occupation, as the US was worried about the coming Korean War and the heating up Cold War, they pressured Japan to rearm. But actually, despite having a conservative government, they said no. They wouldn't change the Constitution. As the Americans wrote the Constitution, it would take a significant referendum to change it. And this allowed them to invest instead in the economy. They did, however, build a national police force, which later became the Self-Defense Force, which I don't have a sense of how big it is now. But with the newly re-elected and further empowered prime minister, they're looking to expand into having offensive weaponry, which had been prohibited previously. There was a big deal in the early 90s. The Japanese cut a check for the Gulf War rather than fighting because it's against their constitution. They got a pretty hard time in the press. But they do now send troops out on peacekeeping missions, though they don't fight. So for instance, they helped in Iraq in the second time around, but they actually had to be guarded by the British troops because they weren't allowed to carry guns. So it's a number of rules, but the current, the newly re-empowered Conservative Party hopes to normalize Japan, which means to revise its constitution to remove the pacifist clause and have a normal army again. Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I am only functionally literate on computers. So I could do this, but I couldn't get it to work into anything where you could see all of it at once. But I will put it up on the webpage.
Could you recommend a folk tale about samurai for younger children? We looked at that one, Winning Without Hands.
I don't know that one.
Well, I wasn't impressed.
All right, so maybe that's a good thing.
Shove the guy into an island rather than kill him with your sword. But
Well, I think, so one of the slides I had was a screen from the Tale of the Heike, which I think might be, it's a good little scene. This one is, what is this scene called? Is it Yasumori? Or no, that's Atsumori. Yeah, the fan one. So this is a scene. I can't remember the name of it. I'll Google it when we're done. But it's a scene. This is a work that's been translated. It's really long, but it was sung, and originally it was sung one scene at a time, not necessarily in order. And this was a very popular scene. And this is as the Minamoto army are forcing the Taira into retreat. After the battle, they have as the one side retreats on the boats, the other side's watching them on shore. They have a woman go up and put a fan on a pole. And so the army on the shore sees this as an insult to their prowess as warriors. Says that we have to shoot it down. And you have to shoot it down the first time. And so they choose a warrior to come out who has to get ready and get yelled at by his commander. You better hit this thing. And he wades out into the water, is moving up and down with a moving target and hits it down, and everyone applauds for him, which is a nice tale without decapitation.
Is it a gun?
It's an arrow, a bow and arrow.
Oh, bow and arrow.
So this would have been in 1184, I think. And there are a number of good stories in there, but there is a good deal of violence associated with many of them.
Anything regarding just the sword, the samurai itself, the swords?
The sword of the samurai, I can't think of any. I'm not a big fan of the cult of the sword. I think it was really ritualized in a time when swords weren't used. It became emblematic of class privilege during the Edo period. So it was a sign that you were of this privileged class, and actually some merchants were able to buy the right to wear swords. And you rarely use them. There are all these tales of the rights of samurai to punish commoners as they saw fit, and to some degree that's true, but I don't think it happened very frequently. And the idea of it being the warrior's primary weapon is a fallacy, I think. Certainly there...
I didn't think their first thing was to use their sword. I thought it was like one of their last.
Yeah, that would be the last resort, really. So for the first good chunk of Japanese history, it's the bow and arrow, without question, from at least the 8th century, if not much earlier. And then it's the mounted archer from the late 8th century is the unit of power. However, once you get to the 16th century, when you have guns, it's a big game changer because you can recruit so many more people. For the mounted archer, you need training. But to shoot a musket and take turns, anyone can do it. And so Nobunaga, the terrorizing guy, was one of the early adopters of muskets. And this is a battle he destroyed the best cavalry in the country, just annihilated them in one battle. By using.
The last samurai, because they used him as the one destroying the whole cavalry.
Yeah, so they a similar strategy. He set up essentially a fence or a wall and had musketeers 3 lines deep, and they just took turns and they charged into a line of guns. It's not unlike World War I. But brilliant technology, brilliant use of technology, but not as romantic.